Welcome to the Parenting with Impact podcast with your hosts Elaine, Taylor-Klaus, and Diane, Dempster, co-creators of ImpactParents.com, an online community, award-winning blog, and service organization helping parents all over the world to raise complex kids become capable, independent adults.
Hi everyone, Elaine and Diane here, and we know that you want your complex kids to grow up to be happy and independent, and yet you're not always sure how or when to help with that.
In this podcast, we'll encourage you to collaborate with all kinds of complex kids and support them in navigating life and learning.
And we'll interview leading experts from around the world, as well as parents in our own community, talking about how training for parents actually helps these complex kids.
We'll talk about the issues we hear parents struggling with all the time and how a coach approach can support and empower your amazing young people.
We won't tell you what to do. We're going to help you figure out how. So let's move on to the next conversation. Welcome back, everybody, to another conversation in the Parenting with Impact podcast. Today, I have Dr. Supreet Mann from Common Sense Media, and we're going to be having some real conversation here today. I was just explaining to Dr. Mann that this is the beginning of a series of conversations we're going to be having about the risks our kids face in the realm of technology, and particularly with graphic content that's adult content that kids are having access to at unbelievable young ages, actually. And part of this conversation started when my 23-year-old made a kind of casual comment to me about how there was no kid he knew of his age in his generation who hadn't been traumatized by the internet. And that really got my attention and got me doing some research and reaching out to Common Sense Media to try to find out what's really going on. Because, we do a lot of work with parents of teens and young adults. And this issue of my kids addicted to technology, is always on technology, can't get off technology, is already a high issue. And I don't think even I realized the extent to which young people, teens and young adults, are using adult material in ways that certainly were surprising for me to learn about. So thank you to Supreet Mann and Common Sense Media, not only for doing this groundbreaking research, but for coming and joining me to talk about it. So
thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad you're here. So let's start by just kind of set the stage. You're the director of research at Common Sense Media. Tell us just briefly, what is Common Sense Media and what kind of research do you tend to be doing?
Sure. Common Sense Media is the nation's leading advocacy firm looking at ways that we can protect children and from the potential harms of social media. On the research side, we aim to do a lot of research looking at the way children are using media, learning from media, and try to discern some of the ways that parents and caregivers can help to manage their children's media landscape.
Right. And so this isn't about eliminating media from kids' lives. Right?
No, this is about managing that media influx that they're being exposed to on a day-to-day basis.
On a day-to-day, right. And when we, years ago, before the pandemic, or right at the beginning of the pandemic, we did what we called a digital sanity summit. And the universal theme from all of the experts we interviewed at that time, and that's really no different today, was about helping our kids begin to move into a healthy relationship with technology. Mm-hmm. Understanding that technology is here, it's not going anywhere. How do we learn to be in a relationship with it? And how do we raise our kids to be conscious users of their own media instead of to become victims of it in any way? Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So you do a lot of research in a lot of different areas. Let's talk about something that's hard for people to talk about, which is what happens and the ways in which kids are getting access to materials that are really not designed for them at whatever age. What can you tell us?
Yeah, sure. So at Common Sense, we did a really interesting report back in late 2022, early 2023, looking at teens and pornography use. So we surveyed just over 1,000 teens aged 13 to 17 to figure out what their pornography use looked like, to determine how they're accessing pornography, whether that pornography exposure is purposeful, so they're seeking out that pornography, versus unintentional pornography exposure, if they're being shown it by peers or accidentally clicking links, things like that. And it was a really interesting study. It was one of the first of its kind. It's very difficult to do research on teens and pornography, as you can probably
I
imagine.
can imagine.
So,
Yeah.
yes. So it was a really groundbreaking study in a lot of ways that really shed a lot of light on what this space looks like and what access in this space looks like. And what we found is that the vast majority of our respondents, 73% of those aged 13 to 17, have watched pornography online. And more than half of those kids had been exposed by the time they were 13, with the average age of first exposure being 12. Really,
Okay.
we know that kids,
So average age 12.
average age was 12, but
Okay.
54% had been exposed by the time they were 13.
Okay. So if average age was 12, that meant that some of them were younger than that.
Yeah. And the youngest that we asked was 10 or younger, right? And I think it was about 15 to 20%, somewhere in there, had been exposed by age 10 or younger.
Wow. Okay. Well, that must have been sobering to discover. What else?
It was. The other thing that was really interesting was we often think about pornography as a boys issue. And what we found is that teen girls and teen boys were viewing pornography at pretty much the same rates. Now, there were some differences between intentional exposure and accidental exposure. So what we found was that teen boys were more likely to purposefully seek out pornography than teen girls. They were more likely to be exposed unintentionally. But overall, it's not just a boys issue. This really is an issue that transcends children across gender. So that was also one of the very interesting findings and kind of changed the way we've often talked about pornography in terms of exposure.
Right. So much for boys will be boys.
Right, exactly. And there's probably some argument there that, well, what does unintentional really look like? And it's not as, it can look like a lot of things, right? So unintentional might be as simple as your peer turning their phone around to show you an image that you shouldn't have otherwise seen. But it could also be links that are coming into your inbox, right? So unintentional exposure can look very differently and it can happen across different spaces. So also something really important to note that these teens may not be seeking out pornography, but they are still being exposed to pornography at very high rates.
Okay. What does high rates mean?
High rates mean that there was a large chunk of teens, both boys, girls across. We oversampled LGBTQ plus teens as well. And we found that there's just a large rate of kids that are being exposed to pornography unintentionally. So the most often cited way that unintentional pornography exposure happens is by clicking on a link from a website that they shouldn't have seen. Second, most often is by a peer or classmate showing them pornography. And that classmate really brings in the issue of pornography viewing at schools, which was something else that we asked. We asked teens how often they have viewed pornography in schools or on school issued devices. And we also found high numbers of those that had viewed pornography in that way as well.
So when you say high numbers,
yeah, about a third of those that we asked had viewed pornography on school issued devices or in schools.
so what does that mean? Does that mean that the school systems aren't screening well enough? Does that mean these kids are just really clever? Like, what's the implication of that?
What's interesting, I think that it probably doesn't differ that much to when we think about what this may have looked like in the pre-cell phone days, right? How different is this really than somebody bringing their parents' Playboy to school and showing friends on the playground? It probably doesn't differ a whole lot. Where it really starts to differ, though, is that barrage of new images and different types of images that kids are being exposed to, right? So it's not just one image, it's many images that they're being exposed to. And sometimes those images are violent. Over half of children who had been exposed to pornography report that they've seen pornography that depicts violence, including rape, choking, sexual assault. So that's also very alarming, right? Is they're not just being exposed to pornography at high rates, they're being exposed to violent pornography. And they're much less likely to be exposed to pornography that shows consent.
Right. So many directions to go with this. What was the sense if what they're experiencing is sometimes inappropriate, not just inappropriate, but violent and scary, for lack of a better word? Were you able to get any sense of how that's informing their relationships or their sense of their own sexuality or sexual dynamics?
Yeah, and this might be a little bit of a silver lining, is what the findings reported were that while a majority of kids who are viewing pornography, whether that's intentional or unintentional, have seen violent pornography. A large majority, I think it was around 70%, also recognize that pornography is not real and it does not depict real sexual experiences. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that it's not shaping what their understanding of sexual experiences might be. But at least for the purposes of this question of does pornography seem realistic or real to you, at least in that space, kids are not so likely to view it in that way. So that might be the sort of silver lining here, is that perhaps if we were to talk to kids earlier and earlier about what this looks like, talk to kids about what healthy sexual experiences look like, we might be able to shape that even more.
Yeah. Well, and that would require having open conversations about healthy sexual experiences.
Absolutely,
I
absolutely. And
suspect you have some research on that too.
I do, in fact. We also asked, and like I said, this was one of the first studies of its kind. We really tried to cram in as many questions as we could about what their sexual landscape and pornographic experience looks like. And another thing that we asked them was how often they're talking to adults or trusted caregivers or adults about what they're seeing online. And we asked about other things too. We asked how often they're talking to trusted adults, caregivers about sex, perhaps about birth control, things like that. And what we found is that there's pretty high numbers of kids, over half, are talking to their parents or trusted caregivers about birth control, about sex and relationships. But the percentage of kids that are talking to those same people about pornography is much, much less, right? So it was only 27% that reported that they had talked to a parent, caregiver, or trusted adult about pornography.
And was there a correlation with that to unintentional exposure?
We didn't look at correlations between that and unintentional exposure. What we did ask kids, though, was if they wanted to talk to a parent or a trusted caregiver about pornography. And I think, unsurprisingly, most did not. Most did not say that they wanted to talk to their parents about pornography, which I can understand.
Yeah.
But it was the younger kids that were more likely to say that they were willing to talk about or wanted to talk to their parents about pornography. So the 13, 14-year-olds, almost half of them said that they would like to talk to their parents. And that number drops off as they got older. So the 16 and 17-year-olds, it was much lower rates, said that they wanted to talk to their parents. So they're kind of sheds this light that there might be that sort of sweet spot where we can jump in, talk about pornography early on when kids might be more open to having those conversations.
Yeah, so the preteens are an opportunity to anticipate, but by the time they get to be teenagers, they're already separated out a little bit.
Right, right.
So I want to talk about what should we be talking to them about, but I don't know that I want to go there quite yet. What else is in this data or research that do you think we should know?
We also, like I said, we oversampled LGBTQ plus teens. We were really interested in how exposure to pornography differs for that group of kids. And what we found was that rates of intentional pornography consumption were higher among those that reported being LGBTQ plus, including transgender and non-binary respondents. So rates of intentional exposure were about 66% for that group. So overall, they're more likely to seek that out on purpose, where overall, I think it was 44% said that they had ever intentionally sought out. So quite a bit higher than the overall population.
So that, which is interesting and yet in some ways not surprising, because the identity issue that they're dealing with has to do with, if not their sexuality, with their sexual parts, right? And
right.
So if you understand the issues in that community, you get that there's a difference between gender and sexuality. But at that age, they're trying to figure it all out. So
Exactly.
It makes a lot of sense.
Right.
How frequently, for those kids who are seeking out porn, how often are kids experiencing this exposure?
Yeah, we did ask kids in the last week how often they had viewed porn, what types of pornography they had viewed. And overall, kids that are viewing pornography are watching it at pretty high rates. The exact numbers are in the report, but if I recall correctly, it was 59% reported watching it once a week or more. And that's among teens who reported watching pornography intentionally. So of the 44% who said that they have ever viewed pornography intentionally, more than half had viewed it once a week or more. And about 41% said that they've watched it less than once a week.
Wow. Okay. So 59%. And I read something that got me on this kick that was 8 out of 10 days or something, but I could have been, that was also more recent. And I can't reference I can't cite the source on it. But so what I'm hearing, what I just heard you say is that 59% of those who say they seek it out, which was 44% of the
Right.
overall, are watching it at least once a week, if not more.
Exactly. Exactly. And like I said, what before, while they understand that what they're viewing is not real, they do also indicate that they are learning from it as well. So there is this tension there between what they're seeing, knowing that this is a scripted, this is not a real sexual experience, but also using it as a tool to learn about what sex can be.
Wow. All right, let's take a quick break there and we'll be right back. Hi, it's Elaine. And if you like this podcast, you'll love our coach approach. Whether you're a parent looking for support or a professional supporting families, we invite you to download a free guide with 12 key coaching tools at impactparents.com/gift. You can begin using a coach approach to help kids become more independent or improve all of your conversations at work and at home. That's impactparents.com/gift. Welcome back, everybody. My guest is Dr. Supreet Mann from Common Sense Media, and we're having some real talk about some extraordinarily groundbreaking research that Common Sense Media has done on teenagers and pornography, specifically on their exposure and use of pornography. I'm curious, before we move into kind of what are the conversations we want to be having, can you tell us a little bit more? Has there been any research that done on young adults, anybody older than 18, or is it only, I think you said 13 to 18?
Yeah, this report looked at 13 to 17-year-olds. Yeah, and there has been some other work that I'm not quite as familiar on young adults, but nothing quite this comprehensive in terms of how this exposure begins, right? So really looking at sort of the beginnings of this exposure and what this exposure might mean at a really critical developmental period. This is really the first of its kind and quite groundbreaking in that way.
So what are we to understand about the impact on development for a 10, 12, 13-year-old kid?
Yeah, these are kids that are trying to better understand themselves, their own sexual experiences, what their preferences are sexually as well, right? As they're starting to get into adolescence. And I think understanding just how early this exposure can happen, how little conversation is happening between kids and parents, and how younger kids are more likely to want to speak to parents. I think it really highlights just how vulnerable this time is, right? That this is a time where kids are very impressionable. They're really starting to understand their place in the world, and not having these conversations as early as we should be having, I think really can negatively impact the way that these kids are understanding what they're seeing in the media. And when we talk to parents about some of these findings, parents are often quite surprised. They're surprised with the age of first exposure. That information really comes as a shock to them. But when we talk to teachers, educators are not that surprised. They see this happening in their classrooms. They see how conversations are happening with their kiddos in their rooms. And I think that there's a gap there between how parents are understanding what they think is happening and what's actually happening.
So what do you, like, from your lens, what do you want parents to understand better?
I want parents to understand that these are tricky conversations, certainly. These are conversations that are uncomfortable. They're uncomfortable for your kid. They're uncomfortable for you as a parent as well. But they are conversations that need to be had. The same way parents are talking to their kids about sex and relationships at pretty high rates, we need to also be having conversations about pornography, what pornography is, help them better understand how to be critical of what it is that they're seeing and what is healthy and not healthy in terms of sexual relationships. So that kids can really, if they are exposed to this unintentionally, they have a better understanding of what they're seeing and it doesn't shape their own sexual experiences. We want them to learn from their parents and trusted adults first. And that can be hard.
Yeah, I mean, I'm listening to your words and I'm going back to what could I have done differently, right? And I will tell you, I raised my kids in a very open environment. And And I can't say, and I had been a sexual health educator when I was like, they definitely had an open doorway to have conversations with us. And yet, I have to be honest, it didn't even occur to me
Mhm.
to have the conversations. And partly because I was exposed to, the neighbor's playboy or whatever. Like I didn't think about it in harmful ways because it took us a while, I think, to figure out how immersive this whole technology world really is.
Yeah,
Like seeing
absolutely.
somebody's magazine in a basement once or on the playground once is very different from a daily digest
Right.
of exposure.
And a constant barrage of different types of images and videos as well, right? The one of the ways that we've talked to parents about talking to their kids is by doing it in a way that is structured, is brief, has very set defined talking points, but also in a way that can maybe not feel quite as awkward. So we recommend carpools, right? When you're able to look out the window and you all don't have to make eye contact, that might be one of the easiest times to bring up some of these really difficult conversations. And you have a set defined end point when you get where you need to be, and it can help keep it really digestible, but by still opening up that doorway of I can have these kinds of conversations with my parent.
The other thing that comes up as I hear you say that, Supreet, is how important it is to keep it very matter of fact.
Yeah.
Right? To keep our own fear and anxiety and energy out of it so that we are an open space for our kids to talk to us, to be able to say, hey, I just read this or I heard this or whatever. What do you think about that? As
I
an
abs Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think the other thing is to try to keep judgment out of that space as well, right?
Yeah.
When we see that LGBTQ plus teens are more likely to intentionally view pornography, there's a lot of reasons that could be, right? It could very well be that they're looking for a space to better understand their own sexual experiences because they maybe don't have peers or trusted caregivers that they feel they can connect with. So perhaps that is a space that allows them some of that freedom. So really trying to hold your judgment, keep the conversation as positive and judgment free as possible. Yeah, I completely agree. I think it is important to be having those conversations.
Yeah. So I hear non-judgment, positive, matter of fact, manage our own emotional reactivity around it, right? Keep it simple, keep it fairly brief, right? This is not, we need to sit down and have the talk, but it's about creating an environment that helps our kids see us as a safe place to explore. The other thing that's coming up as we're talking is to stay open and curious, right? To find out what our kids are curious about
Yeah,
and to be a resource for them rather than, Dr. Google or
absolutely.
Dr. Black
Absolutely.
Web or whatever it is,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Beautiful. Supreet, thank you. I really want to acknowledge the research and the effort to look at this issue because I can imagine there are many people who thought it shouldn't be done. And I think it's really important for us to understand what our kids are being exposed to and how to best support them through it. So thank you for the work you're doing at Common Sense Media. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about how people can find out more about Common Sense in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. Our research report and this and other research reports related to things like teens and mental health, media access more broadly, and some of our larger census reports that look at the sort of state of kids' media use in terms of the amount of time that they're spending. All of those things can be found on our main website, commonsense.org/research. And alongside this piece, we do also have a companion piece that helps provide some guidance for parents that are seeking information about how to talk to their kids about this topic, written by Dr. Emily Rothman from Boston University. And I think you'll find that's a really helpful piece for parents who are trying to figure out how to navigate this space.
Okay, so what I will commit to everybody is we will make sure that we get the specific links from Dr. Mann for both the research, this particular research, but also the follow-up that you're referencing. And you can always find all of these resources at commonsense.org/research. But we will make sure to put some other links in the show notes for you to do that deeper dive without having to search everywhere for it. So What else have we not talked about that you want to make sure we include? Or is there something we have talked about that you want to kind of hit home? How do you want to wrap up this conversation?
I think we've talked about a lot of the things that I think are particularly important from this report. We've talked about how important it is for parents to have these conversations, how younger kids are more likely to want to have these conversations, and just the amount of violent content that children may be exposed to in social media. But I also want to highlight that we also looked at racial and ethnic stereotypes across pornography. And one of the other really important findings is that kids of color are also being exposed to racial ethnic stereotypes in pornography at higher rates. And they're more likely to feel bad about themselves because of it, right? They're more likely to say that seeing racial ethnic stereotypes about Black people, if they're a Black kid, are more likely to say that made them feel disgusted or self-conscious, right? And what we really want to understand is that while kids understand pornography may not be real, they also do see themselves and they also are using pornography as a learning tool. So it really is important, not just from a pornographic exposure perspective, but from a sort of whole child development perspective, that we think about what it is that they're seeing. Don't villainize pornography in that it's this completely taboo space that we shouldn't talk about. Think of pornography as a fringe way of them connecting with other people online, that it is a way that they are using viewership to shape their own life experiences and worldview, and use it as a way to really open up that space for conversation.
So, and what I'm hearing is conversation not only about what they're curious about or interested in, but also to debunk some of the stereotypes that they may be exposed to,
Right.
to help them see that they're not actually seeing themselves, even though they look like them.
Right, right. To help them understand where these stereotypes are coming from, why those stereotypes are problematic, and to help reaffirm who they are as a person.
Yeah. And as I'm hearing you say that, I want to also affirm what's really, really important, whether your kid was unintentionally or intentionally exposed. It's really important that we don't collapse their behavior with their value as a person, right? They're not bad for being curious about exploring, exposure, whether they're seeking it or not. It doesn't make them bad kids. It makes them kids in this modern age. And I think that distinction is really important for us to remember and for us to communicate to our kids that they're not bad people because of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, especially for the younger kids, although for all of them, I love that term that you just used. We don't want to villainize it. It's a part of the fabric of the world we're in, whether you agree with it or not, or like it or not. And
Absolutely.
so to put it into the context of their curiosity and their exploration rather than judging or demonizing the behavior as, quote, bad.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
right. All right, my friend, thank you again for what you're doing and for sharing your expertise. I hope I can call upon you again the next time y'all have a major research study, because this is great and it's a rare opportunity for us. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank
I
you.
appreciate it.
I'm
And to
glad we're
those of you
sharing.
who are listening, thanks for what you're doing for yourself and for your kids. This is not an easy conversation to hear, and it's not going to be some easy conversations for you to have with your kids, whatever age. And I want to challenge you to really think about what's the insight you're taking from this conversation with Dr. Mann. What are you aware of now? Which of the pieces are really sticking at you? What's got your attention? And what do you want to do with this information moving forward? What kinds of conversations do you want to have with your kids? What do you want to commit to yourself to begin to get into a dynamic or a conversation that can be, let your kids know that you are open and available to them? What might that look like for you and your family? And remember, your role, your engagement, your availability to your kids, it makes an enormous difference, folks. So thanks for being here. Thanks for being there for your kids. And we'll talk to you. Note that there's going to be a couple more conversations coming after this one. So I encourage you to tune into the whole series and hope to see you in the next one. Take care, everyone.
You've been listening to the Parenting with Impact podcast with Elaine and Diane. For more information on the Impact Parents community or to join Sanity School for Parents, please visit impactparents.com. If you like what you've heard, please share this podcast with friends who need similar guidance and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. For the essentials of Elaine and Diane's coach approach to parenting, download a free tip sheet at impactparents.com/podcast.
Behavior therapy training for parents is actually recommended as a first-line treatment for complex kids. For information about Sanity School, our training program for parents or teachers, which has helped thousands of families around the globe, visit impactparents.com/sanityschool.